My wife has always had this insatiable craving for change, like she couldn't stand the monotony of a steady routine. It was as if predictability weighed her down, and she was constantly itching to break free of it. I still remember the day she came back from visiting her friend, practically buzzing with excitement, more so than usual. She told me about this friend, a wealthy woman with a sprawling estate, the kind you'd see in glossy magazines, complete with a stable full of horses. Apparently, this friend had sparked some grand idea in her head. Now, my wife wanted us to get a horse. A horse? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Where on earth were we supposed to put a horse? We weren't exactly living in the countryside with endless fields to spare. Our modest backyard barely had space as it was, what with the garden, the kids' play area, and all the chaos that comes with family life. I remember asking her directly, "Where are you planning to keep this horse? You realize we're already drowning in responsibilities, right?" We had two dogs that required constant attention, three cats who ruled the house as if they owned it, and, most importantly, two kids who seemed to need us every waking second of the day. Her response? She laughed. A light-hearted, dismissive kind of laugh, followed by, "Oh, I'll figure something out." But it wasn't her laugh that got to me. It was the look in her eyes, stubborn, determined, unyielding. I'd seen that look before, and I knew it meant one thing. This wasn't going to blow over. It was absurd. A horse wasn't just another pet. It was a colossal responsibility. Feeding it, caring for it, finding space for it. None of that seemed to cross her mind. It was like she was blinded by some fleeting fantasy. I laid it all out for her, point by point. The cost, the upkeep, the impracticality. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just being honest, realistic. We had enough on our plates already, and adding a horse into the mix felt like inviting chaos into our lives. But instead of understanding, she looked at me like I was the villain, like I was crushing her dreams just for the hell of it. I couldn't wrap my head around why she always needed to shake things up. It was always something, some new hobby, some wild scheme to improve our lives. And it wasn't like our lives were dull. Two young kids alone kept us on our toes, and the idea of throwing a horse into that chaos, it felt like madness. I had a hunch her friend was behind this. I never cared much for that woman. Every time my wife came back from seeing her, she was full of these impractical, over-the-top ideas that didn't fit our reality. And now, thanks to her, we were in the middle of this ridiculous horse debate. My wife wasn't letting it go, though. She shifted gears, trying to sell me on the idea. She claimed it would be great for the kids, that it could teach them responsibility, that it would be good for their growth. I wasn't buying it. Our kids already had plenty of chances to learn responsibility, feeding the dogs, cleaning up after themselves, helping with chores. They didn't need a horse to hammer the lesson home. It felt like she was just grasping at straws, trying to justify something that was clearly unreasonable. I tried to keep calm, to stop it from escalating into a full-blown argument, but my patience was wearing thin. I finally told her, firmly, "It's not happening. We're not getting a horse." I laid it out as plainly as I could. We needed to focus on what we already had: our kids, our home, our life. Adding a horse would only complicate everything. She didn't take it well. The look she gave me was piercing, like I was the bad guy in all of this. And for a brief second, I felt guilty. But then I reminded myself why I was saying no. This wasn't about stomping on her happiness. It was about keeping our family grounded, about maintaining some sense of stability. Someone had to keep us on track, and if that meant being the bad guy, I could live with it. That night, the tension was thick. She barely said a word to me, and when she did, it was clipped and cold. I knew her mind was still on the horse, and I could tell she was silently hoping I'd change mine. But I wasn't going to. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about the kind of life we were building. I wanted consistency, a solid foundation for our kids, a life where they felt secure. I wasn't going to throw that away for one of her whims, no matter how much she wanted it. And honestly, this wasn't the first time. Every time she spent time with that friend, it was like she came back a different person, swept up in some fantasy that didn't fit our reality. This horse idea was just the latest in a long line of impractical schemes. Apparently, her friend had a pony in her backyard, and somehow my wife thought that meant we needed one too. But her friend didn't live in the real world, not like we did. She had the money to indulge in these things without a second thought. And yet here we were, caught up in her fantasy like it was supposed to be our reality. It always came down to everything being wrong whenever my wife spent time with her friend. She'd come back home acting like what we had wasn't enough anymore, craving something more, something bigger. At first, I tried to be understanding. I knew how much she valued that friendship, and I didn't want to be that guy, the overbearing husband who forbids his wife from having friends. But deep down, I saw it clearly. Her friend wasn't just a buddy, she was a bad influence. That woman had a knack for filling my wife's head with impractical dreams and far-fetched ideas, all wrapped up in the guise of empowerment. And guess who had to bring everything crashing back to reality? Yep, me. I finally told my wife what I thought. Straightforward, no sugarcoating. I said her friend was trouble. I knew it had upset her, but I wasn't about to pretend otherwise. Predictably, she didn't take it well. She accused me of being judgmental, of always trying to crush her dreams. But that wasn't it at all. It wasn't about her dreams. It was about keeping our lives grounded. I wanted her to be happy, sure, but not at the cost of unraveling everything we'd built together. We had responsibilities, 2 kids, bills to pay, and a life that demanded some measure of practicality. She didn't see it that way. To her, I was the enemy, the killjoy standing between her and what she wanted. The argument that followed was brutal. She said I never supported her ideas, that I always shot them down. I fired back, telling her someone had to think practically, and that wasn't the same as being unsupportive. But she didn't want to hear it. To her, I was just negative. She said I never wanted to try anything new or fun. It was maddening trying to make her understand. It wasn't about being a stick in the mud. It was about making smart choices for the sake of our family. Take her latest fixation, a horse. A horse. A horse was completely out of the question. We weren't in a position to handle something like that, no matter how much she wanted it. And trust me, she really wanted it. Seeing her so upset hurt, but I couldn't cave. Someone had to be the rock, the one keeping things steady while she let her friends stir up these reckless fantasies. Her friend didn't live in our world. She didn't have 2 little kids relying on her. She wasn't juggling family needs against the backdrop of a paycheck that had to stretch far enough. It was easy for her to encourage wild ideas because she wouldn't have to deal with the fallout. After the fight, things were icy. My wife barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was clipped and cold. She was mad, sure, but I could handle her anger if it meant protecting our family from chaos. I kept thinking about her friend in the days that followed. It wasn't just about the horse, it was what her friend represented, this carefree, consequence-free way of living that was so far removed from our reality. I just wish my wife could see it too. See why I was always the one saying no. Eventually, she offered a compromise. She'd settle for riding lessons instead of buying a horse. No long-term commitment, no massive expense, just a few sessions at her friend's stable. Compared to the alternative, it seemed like a reasonable middle ground. To her credit, she even tried to lighten the mood. She cracked a joke about how maybe the lessons would spice things up in the bedroom. It was her way of smoothing things over, and I appreciated the effort. I laughed and played along, telling her if that's what it took to end the argument, then go for it. Once we agreed, she moved fast. Within days, she'd arranged everything with her friend and was signed up for her first lesson. She seemed genuinely excited, and a small part of me was relieved to see her shift from frustrated to enthusiastic. When she came home after the first lesson, she was practically glowing. She couldn't stop talking about the horse she rode, how nice the instructor was, and how much she loved the experience. I listened, nodding in the right places and offering the kind of support she was looking for. Over time, it became clear that this wasn't just a passing whim. She came back from each lesson with stories about her progress, about learning new techniques. I'd nod, listen, and tell her I was glad she was enjoying herself. In a way, it was a win for both of us. She got her freedom, her me time, and I didn't have to deal with the chaos of owning a horse. For a while, it felt like balance, a small piece of independence for her and stability for us. If that kept the peace, I could live with it. She never invited me to come watch her ride, and honestly, I was okay with that. I didn't really have much interest in it, and honestly, it probably worked out better that way. She'd come home and tell me about how things went, and I'd give her a thumbs up, pretending I understood what she was talking about. It wasn't my thing, but I could at least appreciate how focused and determined she was. She had found something that she genuinely enjoyed, and that was better than the endless arguments and her restlessness at home. If this was what made her happy, I could deal with it. Still, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder how long it would last. Chloe had a history of diving headfirst into things, only to lose interest once the novelty wore off. It made me think that this might just be another phase, but for now it seemed to be sticking. She wasn't talking about buying a horse anymore, and she wasn't pushing me to take on more than we could handle. The lessons were enough for her, and that was good enough for me. I'd take the peace wherever I could find it. In the end, the riding lessons turned out to be a decent compromise. She got to live out her horse dreams, at least in part, without us having to turn our lives upside down. I got to keep things steady at home without the chaos of adding another animal to care for. It wasn't perfect, but it was a balance we could both live with. Maybe that was the best I could hope for. We weren't fighting about it anymore, and she was happy. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. After she started riding, I noticed a few changes in her. She started coming home later than usual. At first it was just a few minutes, but before long, it was stretching into hours. She always had an excuse. The lessons ran late, or she stayed behind to help at the stable. I tried not to think too much of it, but something felt off. What really stood out was how she came back in such a good mood. Normally, after a long day or some hard physical work, people are exhausted. But Chloe, she seemed more energized, more upbeat than I'd ever seen her. It was like she was coming home from a party, not a stable. That didn't sit right with me. I knew what it felt like to be wiped out after a long day. You want to take a shower and crash on the couch. But not her. She'd come in practically glowing, rambling on and on about how much fun she had, how great the horses were, and how much she was learning. I'd nod along, trying to keep up, but something about it felt strange. Maybe it was her sudden enthusiasm or the way she'd brush off questions about why she was getting home so late. I didn't want to be that kind of husband, the one who doubts everything his wife does. I wanted to trust that she was just really enjoying herself, that this was a good thing for her. But as time went on, it felt like her mood was just too good to be true. She wasn't just happy, she was giddy, like a teenager with a crush. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd go on and on about the stable, the horses, the instructor. She always made sure to mention how helpful he was, how he was teaching her new techniques. She said it so casually, but something about it made me uneasy. I didn't say anything at first. We just found a compromise that seemed to work for both of us, and I didn't want to rock the boat. But the late nights kept getting later, and her excuses started to sound thinner. She'd tell me she lost track of time, or that she stayed behind to help clean up, but none of it made sense. She'd come home looking like she hadn't broken a sweat. Her clothes were neat, her hair perfect. That didn't fit with what I knew about spending hours at a stable. I'd been around horses before. They're messy animals. You don't leave them looking like you just walked out of a salon. I tried to push the thoughts away. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just having more fun than I realized. Maybe she found something in these lessons that made her feel good. Something that took her mind off all the stress of our everyday lives. But the more I tried to tell myself that, the harder it became to ignore that nagging feeling that something was wrong. She was different, not in a bad way, necessarily, but in a way that made me feel like I wasn't part of her life anymore. She wasn't just late or overly happy, she seemed distant too. When she was home, she still took care of the kids and did everything she normally did, but something was missing. It was like her mind was somewhere else, like she was only half present. I'd catch her staring off into space, a small smile on her face, and when I'd ask her what she was thinking, she'd just shrug and say, "Nothing." That wasn't like her. She had always been open with me, always willing to share what was on her mind. But now it felt like there was a wall between us, a part of her life I wasn't allowed to see. One night after the kids were in bed, I decided to ask her directly. I needed to know why she had been coming home so late, why she seemed so different. She looked at me surprised, like she hadn't realized I'd noticed. She gave me the same answer she always did, and I knew right away it wasn't the full truth. The lessons were running late, that she was just having a good time. I nodded, but I could tell she was holding something back. There was a hesitation in her voice, a flicker of something in her eyes that made me think she wasn't telling me the whole story. I didn't push it, I let it go, but the feeling stayed with me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that everything was fine, that she was just enjoying herself, and that I was reading too much into it, but the changes were hard to ignore. She was happier, sure, but it felt like a happiness that didn't include me. It was like she'd found something else, something outside of our family that gave her a sense of joy that I couldn't compete with. I didn't know what to do with that feeling. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but another part of me was afraid of what I might find out. So I kept quiet, hoping that whatever it was, it would pass and things would go back to normal. One evening, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was late, the house was quiet, and my wife was in the shower. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to take a look in her bag. I'm not proud of it. It's not the kind of thing I ever thought I'd do. But the unease had been eating away at me for weeks. I felt like I needed some kind of answer, even if it wasn't one I wanted to hear. Her bag was sitting there on the kitchen counter, and before I could torque myself out of it, I unzipped it and started looking inside. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe I thought I'd see something that would put my mind at ease, a harmless explanation for why she'd been acting differently, but what I found only made things worse inside her bag. I found a neatly folded set of dry clothes that in itself wasn't all that strange. She'd mentioned before that sometimes she'd change after her lessons. But then underneath the clothes, I saw something that made my stomach drop: a pack of condoms, and not just any condoms, extra large ones. I just stood there for a moment staring at them, my mind racing. There was no reason for her to have those. None. My heart started pounding, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I knew I shouldn't be looking through her things, that this wasn't the way to handle whatever was going on between us, but I couldn't help it. I needed answers, and what I was seeing only raised more questions. Why would she have those? She hadn't mentioned anything about needing condoms, and we hadn't used them in years. It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the worse I felt. My mind started going to dark places, thinking about all the things that could be happening behind my back as I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I heard the water shut off in the bathroom. Panic set in. I quickly shoved everything back into her bag, trying to put it back exactly the way I'd found it. My hands were shaking, and I could barely think straight. I zipped the bag, close just as I heard her footsteps coming down the hall. I stepped away from the counter, trying to look casual, like I hadn't just been rifling through her things. She walked into the kitchen, towel wrapped around her hair, and gave me a smile. I forced myself to smile back, my heart still pounding in my chest. She didn't seem to notice anything was off. She walked over to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and started talking about her day. I nodded along, barely hearing what she was saying. My mind was still on what I'd found, trying to figure out what it meant. I couldn't bring myself to ask her about it. Not yet. I didn't even know how I began to explain why I was looking through her bag in the first place. So I just stood there pretending everything was fine, even though nothing felt fine anymore. That night I lay in bed next to her, staring up at the ceiling. She fell asleep quickly, as if nothing was wrong, but I couldn't close my eyes every time. I tried. I saw those condoms, saw her smiling face, and it made me feel sick. I wanted to believe there was some kind of reasonable explanation, something that would make all of this make sense, but I couldn't think of anything. The doubts that had been goring at me for weeks were now screaming in my head, and I didn't know how to quiet them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thoughts kept swirling in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on. Chloe lay next to me, fast asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I watched her for a while, torn between the urge to trust her and the growing suspicion gnawing at me. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know the truth. I reached over to her nightstand and picked up her phone. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, my heart racing. I knew it was wrong. I knew that going through her phone was a betrayal of trust, but the doubts had been eating me alive for weeks. I felt like I had no choice. I needed answers. I unlocked her phone, my hands trembling, and opened her messages. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, her conversation with her friend. As I scrolled through, my stomach churned with each line I read. She was complaining about me, about the kids, about how exhausting everything was. She felt like she couldn't catch a break. She said she was tired of the constant demands, tired of always being the one holding everything together. A pang of guilt hit me. Maybe I hadn't been as supportive as I thought. Maybe I had been too caught up in my own worries to see how much she was struggling. But then I kept scrolling, and what I saw next made my blood run cold. She was talking about someone else, some guy she'd been seeing. She didn't mention his name, just referred to him as he or him, but it was clear enough. She talked about how exciting it was, how it made her feel alive again. She said she hadn't felt this way in years. It was like a breath of fresh air. My hands started shaking as I read her words, each one feeling like a dagger to my chest. She was having an affair. There was no other way to interpret it. I couldn't stop myself from reading more, even though every word twisted the knife deeper. Her friend was encouraging her, telling her she deserved to be happy, that she shouldn't feel guilty for wanting more out of life. They talked about meeting up again at the stable, just like last time. My heart sank. This wasn't a one-time thing. This had been going on for a while, and they had plans to meet up again this Saturday. A mixture of anger, betrayal, and deep, aching sadness flooded over me. Everything I had feared, everything I had suspected, was true. I placed her phone back on the nightstand, my hands still trembling. I lay back down, staring up at the ceiling. My mind was racing, and I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to wake her up right then and there, to confront her, to demand answers. But another part of me was too stunned to move, too overwhelmed by what I had just learned. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't believe she would do this to me, to our family. I lay there for hours replaying everything I had read. Every word she had written, the way she talked about me, about our kids, like we were just burdens to her. Obstacles in the way of her happiness. It hurt more than I could have imagined. I had always thought we were in this together, that no matter how hard things got, we'd face it as a team. But now it felt like she'd already moved on, like she'd found something better, and I had been too blind to see it. As the first light of dawn started to filter through the curtains, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just act on impulse, not when our kids were involved, not when so much was at stake. I had to be smart about this to make sure that whatever happened next, I was doing what was best for them. But one thing was clear. Things were never going to be the same again. The trust was shattered by what I had read, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The next day, Chloe came to me in the kitchen while I was drinking my morning coffee. She looked a little hesitant, her eyes not quite meeting mine, and she told me that her mom wasn't feeling well. She said she needed to go help her out for a few days, maybe the whole weekend. Her voice was calm and steady, but there was something in the way she said it that made my gut twist. I knew her too well. I could see the little tells, the way she avoided looking directly at me, the slight tremor in her voice. It was all too familiar, and I knew she was lying. She went on, explaining how her mother had been under the weather and could really use some extra help around the house. She said it all with such precision, like she had rehearsed the lines in her head before coming to talk to me. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I didn't want her to know that I already had my suspicions. I didn't want her to know that I knew this wasn't about her mom at all, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The anger and hurt from the night before were still fresh, and I told her I understood, that she should go if her mom needed her. I even tried to sound supportive, asking if there was anything I could do while she was gone. She smiled, a quick, almost relieved smile, and said no. She had everything covered. She thanked me for being understanding, and then she turned away, moving quickly, like she didn't want me to have time to ask more questions. I watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name: anger, sadness, betrayal. She was standing there lying to my face, and I had to pretend like everything was fine. The thing was, I knew her mom wasn't sick. We'd spoken just a few days ago, and she'd been fine. In fact, she had mentioned how excited she was to finally have some quiet time to herself, to get around to working on her garden. There had been no mention of feeling unwell, no hint that she needed help. My wife must have assumed I wouldn't check, assumed I'd just take her word for it. And on the surface, I did. I played the part of the trusting husband, but inside I was already making my own plans. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I'd let her think everything was going according to her plan, but I'd be watching. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I couldn't just sit back and pretend nothing was happening. I had to know for sure. I needed to see it with my own eyes if what I'd read in those messages was true. The thought of her meeting that man again, of her lying to me just so she could go off and be with him, it made my blood boil. I couldn't confront her without proof, but I wasn't just going to let this slide. The rest of the day felt like I was on autopilot. I went through the motions acting like everything was normal. I played with the kids, made them lunch, tried to keep my mind off what I knew was coming. But every time I looked at Chloe, a sharp pang of resentment hit me. She was so cheerful, almost too cheerful, as if she was relieved to have a way out. She packed her bag in the afternoon, throwing in just enough clothes for a few days. She thanked me again for being so understanding, but I could barely force myself to smile. Inside, I was seething. That night, after I put the kids to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at my phone. I had her mom's number saved, and I thought about calling to confirm once and for all that Chloe wasn't there, but I stopped myself. I didn't need to call. I already knew the truth. What I needed now was proof. Something solid that would show Chloe I wasn't as blind as she thought. Something that would make her face what she'd done. I didn't know exactly how I was going to get it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Saturday morning came, and Chloe left just like she'd said she would. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she'd be back in a couple of days, and then she was gone. I watched her car disappear down the street, and once she was out of sight, I went back inside, my mind already set on what I needed to do. I knew she wasn't going to her mother's, and I wasn't about to sit around and do nothing. I needed to see it for myself. I had to prove that what I suspected was true. So after making sure everything was in order for the kids, I grabbed my keys and headed out. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white from the tension. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. That gut feeling wouldn't go away. It kept telling me something was very, very wrong. When I finally pulled into her parents' driveway, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself before getting out of the car. Her parents were surprised to see me, but greeted me warmly, like always. They offered me coffee, and we sat in their living room. I tried to make small talk, but my mind kept drifting. I couldn't stop myself from asking about Chloe, how she was doing, and whether she had arrived yet. Her mother looked confused, then said she hadn't seen her. She glanced at her husband, who shook his head, equally puzzled. I forced a smile, nodding, and told them maybe Chloe was just running late or had gotten caught up. But inside, my heart sank. I knew she wasn't coming. I sat there a little longer, pretending to listen to their conversation, but my mind was elsewhere. All the doubts, all the fears I'd been trying to push away were now staring me in the face. She wasn't there. She'd lied to me, lied to them, and I was the only one who knew the truth. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my coffee cup down, thanked them for their hospitality, and stood up to leave. Her mother looked concerned and asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. As I walked back to my car, I knew what I had to do next. The stable. That's where she said she'd be meeting him, the place her friend had mentioned in the messages. I wasn't sure what I'd find there, but I needed to know. I couldn't keep living with the uncertainty, with all the questions that had no answers. I turned back to her parents, who had followed me out to the driveway, and asked if they wanted to come with me. I told them I thought it might be a nice surprise to show up and see how Chloe was doing. They seemed confused but agreed, and soon enough we were all in my car, heading toward the stable. The drive was quiet. Her parents chatted occasionally, unaware of the real reason we were going. I kept my eyes on the road, my thoughts racing. I hoped, deep down, that I was wrong, that maybe she really was at her mom's, that maybe this whole thing could be explained away. But as we got closer to the stable, the hope began to fade. I knew what I was going to find. I knew it wasn't going to be the innocent explanation I wanted it to be. We pulled up to the stable, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Her parents looked around, curious as I parked the car. I got out and started scanning the area, looking for any sign of Chloe. The place was quiet, with just a few people milling around, but no sign of her. Her parents followed me as I walked toward the entrance. We had arrived at the stable, the heavy smell of hay and animals filling the air. Her parents were still looking around, clearly expecting to see Chloe in the middle of her riding lesson. My eyes scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest, and a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't going to end well. As we moved further in, the sounds from one of the larger enclosed areas caught my attention. Laughter, voices, something that didn't fit with the quiet routine of a normal riding lesson. My gut tightened as I motioned for her parents to follow me. When we rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. There was a group gathered near the horses, but this wasn't a normal group activity. Some of them were naked, others were partially clothed, and it quickly became clear what was going on. My heart sank, and a wave of nausea rose in my throat. They were involved in something twisted, something far beyond what anyone would expect to see in a stable. The horses stood there, some being petted, others lingering as if this was just another day. I scanned the group, hoping, praying, that maybe my wife wasn't part of this, that maybe I was wrong. But then I saw her. She was in the center of it all, completely naked, her body illuminated by the dim light filtering through the stable windows. It felt like time stopped. I could barely breathe as I watched her. Her face flushed, her expression one of pleasure. She was laughing, her hands moving over the man beside her, her body entwined with his. I felt like I was going to choke on the disgust and anger rising inside me. The sight was almost too much to bear. Her parents were just behind me, their eyes wide in shock as they took in the scene. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. Her father stood rigid beside her, looking like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. He stepped forward, his face pale, and called out her name, his voice cracking with disbelief. The sound of his voice cut through the noise in the stable, and everything seemed to stop. The laughter, the movements, everything came to a sudden halt as everyone turned to look in our direction. My wife turned to face us, her eyes going wide as she saw her parents, and me standing there. Her face drained of color, and the smile she had worn just moments before vanished instantly. She froze, her body still, as she took in the sight of her parents, and then me, standing there watching her. For a moment, there was complete silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to hang in the air. I could see the shock and fear in her eyes, the realization of what she had done, and who had just seen it. No one moved. The people around her looked at us, some scrambling to cover themselves, others standing frozen, dumbfounded. My wife didn't move. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, her eyes locked on her father, who was staring at her with a look of utter disbelief and heartbreak. Her mother was crying now, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back the sobs that kept escaping. I felt like I was in a nightmare, like none of this could possibly be real. I wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but no words came. I just stood there, my fists clenched at my sides, my whole body trembling with a mix of anger, betrayal, and disgust. This was the woman I had married, the mother of my children, and here she was, doing something so vile, so beyond anything I could have imagined. The sight of her standing there with those people was like a knife to my heart. Her father finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. He called her name again, but this time it was filled with pain and confusion. She took a step towards us, her lips moving as if she were trying to say something, but no sound came out. The rest of the group began to disperse, some of them slipping into the shadows of the stable, leaving my wife standing there alone and exposed. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The weight of what I had just seen was crushing me from the inside out. The ride back home was one of the longest and most painful experiences I've ever been through. After the shock of what we had just witnessed, her parents were both in a state of disbelief. Her mother sat beside me in the front seat, sobbing quietly, while her father sat in the back, staring blankly out the window, his face pale and ashen. No one spoke. The silence in the car was suffocating, filled only by the sound of her mother's quiet cries and the occasional sniffle. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion. When we finally reached their house, her father seemed to come to life, if only for a moment. He got out of the car, his movements stiff and jerky, like he was in a daze. Her mother followed, her face streaked with tears. I helped her out of the car, not knowing what else to do, as she leaned heavily on me. Her body trembled as we made our way inside. I felt numb, like I was just going through the motions, my mind still struggling to process everything we just witnessed. My wife's father collapsed into a chair, his eyes vacant, as if the life had been drained out of him. It was her mother who finally broke the silence. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. With a sense of determination that seemed to come out of nowhere, she dialed the number. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the operator, her words coming out in broken, halting sentences. She told them what had happened, where we had been, what we'd seen, and that they needed to send someone to the stable. I could hear the disbelief in her voice, like she couldn't quite believe she was actually saying the words out loud. Her father didn't move, his head buried in his hands, shaking slightly. He didn't say a word as his wife relayed the details to the operator, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to convey the horror of what we'd witnessed. When she finally hung up, she just stood there for a moment, her shoulders slumping as if all the energy had been drained from her. She turned to her husband, her eyes filled with tears, but he just shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. Then her father spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She's no longer welcome here," he said, and his words hit me like a punch to the gut. The finality in his tone made my heart sink, the pain and disgust in his voice palpable. Her mother nodded, letting out a choked sob as her face crumpled. They both looked broken, like they had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. I felt a pang of sadness for them. They were grieving too. Grieving for their daughter, for the betrayal, for the life they thought they knew. It wasn't supposed to be like this. None of it was. The decision to cut her out of their lives seemed almost instinctual after that. Her father spoke again, his voice growing stronger as he said that she was no longer their daughter, that she was no longer part of their family. Her mother nodded, wiping at her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. They talked about removing her from the will, making sure she had no claim to anything they'd worked for. It was like they needed to take these steps, like they needed to make it real, to make it final. I stayed quiet, just listening. My emotions were too tangled to find words. Part of me understood why they were doing it, why they felt they had no choice. But another part of me couldn't reconcile the woman I had loved with the person I had just seen. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But there was no going back. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. Her mother eventually stood up, moving toward the kitchen to make tea. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like she was trying to hold herself together. Her father remained in his chair, staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. A deep sadness settled over me, swallowing everything else. Nothing would ever be the same again. The family I had married into, the woman I had built a life with, it was all shattered, broken beyond repair. And as I sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I realized that there was no way forward that didn't lead to more pain. The weeks that followed were a blur. The shock of what I had seen in the stable still haunted me. But there was no time to dwell on it. I had to act. I had to make decisions that would protect my kids and give us a chance to move forward. The first step was filing for divorce. It was a decision that came easily after everything that had happened. There was no saving our marriage, no path to forgiveness. What she had done was beyond anything I could ever accept, and I knew that staying together would only create more pain for everyone involved. I met with a lawyer, and the process began. It was strange sitting in that office, talking about dividing our lives, our home, our assets, our children. There was no anger, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. It was all very matter of fact, almost cold. I just wanted it over with. I wanted to move on, to put as much distance between myself and the memories of what she had done as I could. My focus was on the kids, on making sure they were okay, that they would be shielded from as much of this mess as possible. When the papers were served, she didn't fight it. She knew there was nothing left to fight for. She moved out, taking only what she needed, and went to stay with her friend, the same one who had been there for her through all of this, the one who had encouraged her reckless behavior. I didn't care. She could have her friend, her freedom, whatever it was she thought she needed. I was done. My priority was my children, and I wasn't going to let anything get in the way of giving them the stability they needed. The house felt empty without her, but it was a good kind of empty. There was no more tension, no more lies. It was just me and the kids, and slowly, I could feel a sense of peace returning. Her parents, despite everything, were supportive. They were just as devastated as I was by what had happened, and they wanted to help in any way they could. They began coming by regularly, helping with the kids, offering to take them for weekends to give me a break. It was strange, but also comforting. They were still family, even if their daughter no longer was. I focused on creating a new routine for the kids, something to help them feel secure. I made breakfast every morning, packed their lunches, took them to school. In the evenings, we'd sit down for dinner together, talk about their day, and I'd read to them before bed. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of it all felt like too much. The loneliness would creep in, and I'd find myself staring at the empty space where she used to sit. But I pushed through. I had to. For them. The divorce was finalized quickly, and I was granted full custody. She didn't contest it. I think she knew she couldn't provide the kind of stability the kids needed, not after everything that had happened. She came by once or twice trying to see them, but it was awkward, uncomfortable for everyone. The kids didn't understand why she had left, why everything had changed. I didn't have the heart to tell them the full truth. I just told them that their mom needed some time, that she loved them, but that she couldn't be here right now. It was the best I could do. Slowly, life began to settle into a new normal. The kids adapted, and I found myself learning how to be both a father and, in many ways, a mother to them. Her parents were a big help, always willing to step in when I needed them. They were as committed to the kids as I was, and I was grateful for that. It wasn't the life I had planned, not by a long shot, but it was a life I could work with. It was a life that, in time, I hoped would bring some happiness back to all of us. There were still moments when the pain of what had happened would hit me out of nowhere. A song on the radio, a familiar smell, a memory of better times. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. I was moving forward, one day at a time, and I was determined to give my kids the best life I could. The past was behind us, and while it would always be a part of our story, it didn't have to define our future. We were going to be okay. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually we would be okay.